16. All right, this is the NIV version. I'm talking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I make much of my ministry, and hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection is reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap of the olive root, do not boast over those branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will also be cut off. All right, I'm going to stop there. Here's what we're looking at. The main idea of Romans 11 is verse 1. So I'll read it. Paul asks the question, I ask then, did God reject his people? And the answer is no, by no means. Here's the deal. Romans 11 is about the Jewish, as a nation and as a people, rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Not only to the Jewish people, but to the whole world. But mainly, Jesus came to the Jewish people first, and he preached to them first, and he proclaimed the good news to them first, and he did his miracles in Jerusalem, and they rejected him. Okay, and so Paul in Romans 9, 10, and 11 is answering the question of the Jewish rejection of Jesus. How can we account for this? That they have been waiting for so long for the Messiah, bless you. He shows up and they reject him. How can we explain this? Okay, and so Romans 9, 10, and 11, Paul sets out to explain that problem. And so we're breaking into the middle, really, of Paul's argument for no, God did not reject his people, the Jewish people. Okay, and so here's where I want to start. If you could look with me quickly at verse 17. I'll read it and then I'll do some background so it'll make sense. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap of the olive root, do not boast over those branches. Okay, Paul's using two illustrations here. If you back up to verse 16, he uses the illustration of dough and of a tree and roots. He says here in verse 16, if part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. Here's what he's saying here. I can't do a ton of background on this. We spent a whole night on just this verse. So I don't want to do a ton of background, but here's what he's saying. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people, when they would bring in harvest, they would give first fruits, or the first of it, or a little piece of it, to God, to the temple, as a first fruit offering. Okay, so in this picture, you have a loaf of dough used to make bread, and they would pull off a little piece of it and give it to the temple so that the priest could have food, right? The priest would bake it. It was an offering to God, but it was used most times so that the priest could eat. So when an animal was sacrificed, that food went, that meat went to the priest so that they could eat. And so the first fruits of the grain and the animals and even the sons, the firstborn sons, were given to the Lord as holy. Now the word holy in this verse, verse 16, doesn't mean sinlessness. That's usually how we think of the word holy. It means this: consecrated to God, or set apart for his use. And so there were often objects in the Old Testament, altars and temples and animals that were holy. Well, those things are amoral, meaning they're not moral beings. They can't do right or wrong, right? They're lifeless. Some of them are lifeless objects. So if it's holy, it's not saying it's sinless. It's set apart for God's use. There's certain cups and bowls. Remember in the Old Testament when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians raided Jerusalem and took all the captives. Remember he stole the cup, that golden cup that was used, and he was using it for one of his feasts. And that's when the hand showed up and was writing on the wall. They were using the golden instruments and cups for the temple. Remember that? And the invisible hand shows up and it's writing on the wall and everyone's freaking out. Okay, that's the idea, is cups and bowls and altars and incense and lampstands. These things are holy, not that they're sinless, but they're set apart for God's use. Okay, that's the sense in which we're talking holy here. So what he's saying here is if the first fruits of this dough is holy, then the whole batch is holy. He's referring to the Jewish people. Okay, and he's saying if the first fruits, the whole lump of dough in the first fruits is this, you got the whole nation as a picture of the whole lump. If the first fruits, what would that be picturing? The same illustration is used here of the root. Here's what he says: if the root is holy, then so are the branches. He's using an illustration of a tree. He's saying if the root is holy, then the tree, the branches are holy. He's talking about the Jewish people and he's talking about their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? God, remember in Genesis chapter 12, came to Abraham, who was a pagan, non-Christian, not Jewish, and he came to him and he said, I'm going to make a nation out of you. I'm going to bless you. And he heaped all of these promises on Abraham. And then the scriptures say that Abraham believed God and what? It was credited to him as righteousness. Okay? And from Abraham came Isaac, from Isaac came Jacob, and from Jacob came the 12 tribes of Israel, and from the 12 tribes of Israel came the Jewish people. And so that's the tree, and if you the very beginning of the tree is the roots, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here's what Paul's doing. He's saying, look, if God chose, and he did, the forefathers and made promises to them, and then they were set apart for God's use, that's the holy part, then the rest of the nation is holy or set apart for God's use. Does that make sense, the illustration? Is anyone confused on the illustration? Okay, here's how it applies. Go one down. 17. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not boast over those branches. Here's what he's doing. He's contrasting non-Jewish believers in Jesus and Jewish people who do not believe in Jesus. Okay, the root is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and from them we know came the promises. God made promises to them, the covenants. To them came the scriptures, right? We have the Old Testament scriptures because of the Jewish people, right? The scribes, if you know anything about the scribes in the Old Testament, meticulously copying scriptures, and they would go letter for letter, not word for word, but letter for letter, perfectly spaced. And if there was 3 errors in a whole copy of a book, they would throw the thing away. Actually, it was put in a cabinet thing, and it was locked up. And thankfully, we have found a lot of those ancient manuscripts, not from the Old Testament, but more from the New Testament. And we found those ones that were errors, and so we put all the ones with errors together. And if all, like say we have 100 of them, if 99 have it this way and one has it a different way, then we could probably say the 99 have it right. And that's how we put together the accuracy of the New Testament. And the accuracy of the Old Testament, this is a little side note for you guys, the accuracy of the Old Testament is grounded in the scribal just diligence and their attention to detail. Just really meticulous. Can you imagine being, the book of Isaiah has 66 chapters. Can you imagine being in Isaiah 65 and making the third mistake? You just spent, I don't know, a month copying the thing, and then you can't use it. Right? They didn't have whiteout then. right? Dave's laughing. Look it up. Go to Google and check it out. Okay.